Got to give them something to hope for. I did a panel for the legal project in America a couple of years ago, and there was a very, very nice girl who asked a question at the end, and she said, after hearing you, Mr. Murray, she said, you know, I used to believe in the possibility that the UN could do some good, but now I don't believe that. And I used to believe that maybe the EU had some good. I don't believe that now either. And I thought maybe the UN Human Rights Council, maybe they could do some good. Now I don't believe that. What is there you can give me? I said, you could try alcohol. But before that, let me just give you one other example of how complex this is and is going to be. There's a very there's a very troubling group in Britain called Al-Mujahirun. They're a very, very radical Islamist group. They're forever making extremist statements. In Britain, we showed that they're connected to more terrorism cases of prosecutions in the UK than Al-Qaeda have been. They're a very, very radical, very extreme, very dangerous group. We successfully petitioned my organisation to get them made illegal a little while ago, and it's perfectly clear they were breaking the law. And after a meeting where they reformed and assaulted a colleague of mine. Anyhow, this group, Al-Mujahirun, is a very good example of where our governments are getting it wrong, because Al-Mujahirun is going to, again in a few days in Britain, use the 2-minute silence on the 11th of November, on the day of armistice, to shout and abuse the British Army and to burn poppies, which in Britain, as you may know, is a symbol of remembrance of our fallen from the 2 world wars. Now, they did this last year as well, and they've done it a number of times before. This, to me, would be a very pertinent thing to consider when considering where to draw the lines of so-called hate speech and such behaviour. Because Al-Mujahirun have so far been protected by police whilst they're doing this. Now, 2 years ago in a town north of England, there were returning troops coming back from Afghanistan, and this group, Al-Mujahirun, abused them in the street, held up placards calling them baby killers and so on. And again, they were protected by the police. Locals were very, very angry indeed, and the police made sure that Al-Mujahirun were able to keep going with their protests and so on. Now let me just, the reason I highlight this is for the very key reason, because the behavior of the police in protecting Al-Mujahirun and protecting their alleged right to abuse British soldiers and to abuse the memory of British soldiers led itself to a new problem, which was a group that formed in response called the English Defence League. This is a so-called grassroots movement, mainly working class British people, concerned about these issues. But they themselves have now caused a lot of problems. They go to have big demonstrations in, areas often which are very Muslim, and there are often clashes. So-called anti-racism groups, which tend to be extremists themselves, extreme leftists, turn up, and there are pitched fights and battles, and all sorts of terrible things happen. I cite this for a reason. I don't have the answer to this, but I think it should be considered at least very seriously by the police, whether they aren't contributing themselves to the problem. Because I don't think that the EDL would exist if the police had not responded the way they did to Al-Mujahirun. The perception that they were not defending a legal right, but they were protecting people who were breaking laws, embedded itself, and now we have another problem on the back of that. So I cite that for that just one reason. Finally, I just say this. The response that people tend to cite here is that we must have a political response and so on. But, and apologies to any politicians present, I don't think politicians can lead this, or will lead this. Politicians tend to be way behind any curve. Let me give you one quick example. Almost 3 decades ago, in the early 80s, a head teacher in a school in Bradford in England called Ray Hunniford, said that it should be, said in an article in a conservative magazine called the Salisbury Review, edited by Roger Scruton, said that he thought that his pupils ought to speak English. Now, for that, not only was Ray Hunniford's career destroyed, hounded out of his job, his career was over. Roger Scruton was also hounded out for being the editor of a magazine that would publish such an appalling thing. About 15 years after this, you couldn't find a politician who didn't agree with what Ray Hunniford said. And today, they all do. Nobody in Britain today will say that it is a good idea to encourage people not to speak English, any more than people here coming to Denmark to live and not knowing to speak the language. But then, when it was first said, it was heretical, unbelievable. All the politicians condemned it. How appalling. Now it's common wisdom among them. And if you ever point this out to them, they always say, oh, well, it was the tone that he used. Whenever anyone says it's about tone, you know they've lost the argument on fact. But now everyone says this. You know, 10 years ago, when Lars Hedegaard and I and others were saying all sorts of things about multiculturalism, all sorts of people would attack you. What? Oh, you're not attacking a policy. You're attacking, you're obviously a racist. It must be a racist thing. But now, almost all of the argument has been taken up by Angela Merkel, Nicolas Sarkozy, and David Cameron. Again, they will always say, well, I mean, it was the tone that was used in the argument for, and so on. But the fact is that it was people out of the mainstream who opened up the debate and made it possible for the politicians to walk into it. So this will not be solved by political leadership. It'll be solved by political following. And I would just cite one thing finally for some discussion, which is that the line, I think, is going to have to be defended and fought very hard in all of these discussions, is the crucial divide between hatred of individuals and incitements to violence against individuals, and criticisms of beliefs. And this is, particularly post the Breivik atrocity, a particularly fine line and a particularly important line to keep defending. Because as we have seen in recent days with the Charlie Hebdo apologists, as we have seen since the Danish cartoons, as we have seen now in a whole range of incidents, much of the political leadership in Europe and much of the judiciary does not understand this crucial difference. It does not understand that there is a crucial difference between an imam calling and ordering people to kill individuals, to hate individuals. A crucial difference between that and me saying, for instance, that I think Mohammed made the whole thing up. And that if I say the latter, I am not saying something equivalent to the former. And I'm not inciting any violence, I am stating a fact. And if our societies become incapable of noticing that difference, we're going down a very, very dangerous path. You know, the most famous line, I think, in the freedom of speech discussion is always the quotation from Oliver Wendell Holmes on shouting fire in a crowded theatre and free speech stopping there. But of course, it's, as you all know, a misquotation. And that what Oliver Wendell Holmes said was that the free expression stopped where somebody knowingly and falsely shouted fire in a crowded theatre. But as I have said for many years, and Lars has heard me say many times before, if you are in a theatre and it is on fire, you will have to reserve the right to say so. So thank you very much.
Welcome to be depressed. Want some pressing questions from the speaker who's speak up.
In 1987, we started the opposition against the Danish immigration policy. And we invited Ray Hunford to speak to our meetings. And he was a very cultivated and a very bright and noble man. And I'm very curious, what was his fate when he went back? We talked with him about, in my opinion, the very great English politician Enoch Powell, who had the same fate as far as I know. He was in 1968 excommunicated from Edward Heath and his shadow government. And as far as I know, he was destroyed. I ask you, what was the fate afterwards of Ray Hunford, and is the fate of Enoch Powell a sign that it is not possible to do what we have done in Denmark, to start an opposition against the immigration policy?
Thank you. Quickly, Ray Hunford is currently, I think he has very developed Alzheimer's and has been very ill for some years, and I know his wife and says that this is largely brought on by the horrible things he went through for years, and it was as I say, his career was over. It was an example of a full-scale hounding out and ending of someone's right to pursue their career, indeed, in his case. The case of Enoch Powell is a very interesting one. Does everyone here know or has heard of Enoch Powell? And I'm never quite sure how much it's travelled. I mean, most people remember Enoch Powell for the speech which ended his political career. Certainly ended his political career in mainstream politics, which was the so-called Rivers of Blood speech. I mean, actually, in that case, I said earlier that the tone thing is but I would say, I think that it's been said in recent years that Enoch Powell made it impossible to talk about immigration in Britain for several more decades. I think that's a cop-out by the political class that claims that. But there were undoubtedly elements of what he said that were